In this video, I'm going to explain to you how to answer some of the most commonly asked questions in job interviews with Apple. Question number 1. Tell me about the time when you refused to compromise your standards. Okay, so I believe the reason why this question gets asked is quite obvious. That is, to see on whether you have high standards, right? Even maybe to show a little bit of backbone. And as you'd expect, different types of roles would answer this question specifically to their area of expertise, such as, for example, a sales person could talk about what time when they supported the customer until their concern was fully resolved, even if the customer said, no, we're fine, you insisted to deliver high quality. Or a developer, a software engineer could talk about the time when they disagreed to release so-so code into production, okay? Or, for instance, a manager, an executive types of role could talk about some sort of performance metric, which they relentlessly worked on improving, even if some had thought, hey, this is good enough, okay? So this would be some of the examples you'd want to consider when answering this interview question. Second interview question I'd like to talk about here: if there's something you'd wish you'd improve on, what would it be? Okay, so this question requires you to read a little bit between the lines of why the question gets asked. Okay, so maybe it's not obvious to some of you, but this is basically asking you what's your weakness. Okay, and unless you say something dumb, such as your weakness is interviewing skills, it's not really about the weakness you're talking about, but more about the story you use to back your weakness. Okay, even if you use public speaking, which is probably the number one weakness people use in job interviews, if you back that up with a good story, with a memorable story that is unique to what you've done, then you'll also do well enough on this question. Question number 3: have you ever had a major failure in your professional career? And you notice here I intentionally worded this a failure in a professional career because some people would talk about failures in their personal context, which is, of course, these types of examples have not much in common with job interviews. Except, you want to sell yourself on some specific skill, such as you help charities and stuff like that, but that's something else, right? But okay, so why would someone ask you for a failure story in a job interview? Well, some people, turns out, they think that they never fail, they only learn, and they keep it on the general side of things, and they provide hypothetical answers which don't tend to do really well with behavioral interviews. Or some prefer to shoot themselves in the foot, talking about a failure that got them fired from their previous role 3 weeks ago, and now they're looking for another opportunity. It's too dangerous for the purpose of a job interview. And the best candidates, the best way to answer failure questions is with great learnings, right? So if you structure your answer in the STAR format, then the results part should be the learnings, and I would even recommend you go with half of your answer, talking about your learnings from that experience. Next interview question: why Apple? Right, and a similarly easy question. Everyone, I believe, prepares is going into a job interview. So to give you maybe a little bit of insight from someone who's listening, many of your answers is that many of you over-compliment these companies and these interviewers. And if you hear a dozen candidates complimenting your company every day, you can imagine there's no way you could favor any of those candidates, so you'd have to do something a bit differently. For example, if your CV allows, you could also say something on the lines of, hey, I'm not sure I want to join you just yet. I'm just here to learn about the opportunity and whether we can have a mutually beneficial relationship, Again, if your CV allows, but long story short, try to find something peculiar, something different in your why Apple if you want to make a difference in job interview with your answers. Okay, next interview question. Tell me about the time you had to deal with a highly ambiguous situation and what was the outcome. Okay, so dealing with ambiguous situations, ambiguity in general, is something that usually correlates with candidates with problem-solving skills and people who are good decision makers in general in the face of ambiguity. Okay, now what are some of the mistakes people do here? Would be to talk about stories which are not their subject matter expertise. For example, a time when you deal with an ambiguous situation for a software engineer isn't a time when you had a conflict with a colleague or with management or with leadership. All right, it could be also that you had a conflict as part of that ambiguity, but the ambiguity, the point for you as a developer would be to solve that using data rather than to use your interpersonal skills to gain their trust or to convince someone of something, right? So you should focus on solving the ambiguity using your subject matter expertise, right? Maybe you came up with some new code to prove your point was right, that something was going to work much better. Maybe you found some data. Maybe for an executive, maybe you delegated someone to find the data. Maybe you commissioned a research study to get to get those details that you were interested in. But long story short, use your subject matter expertise to resolve ambiguity, to sell yourself as the better candidate in a job interview, right? Even for a customer support type of role, this would make sense to listen to the customer and to understand what they actually want, right? So listening skills for customer support roles would be highly appreciated in order to prove that you have what it takes to deal with these ambiguous situations successfully, right? Next question. Tell me about the time when you received critical feedback from a manager or peer. Okay, and how did you respond? And is there anything you do differently if you do it all over again? Okay, so this is the type of question who's screening on your interpersonal skills, right? So regardless if you're a developer or a customer support representative or a executive type of role, you would talk about the time when you had a conflict, right? And you would want to show your interpersonal skills. You would want to showcase how you listened to the other to the other side, and eventually, agree that they were right. You shouldn't always be. You could always be wrong as well, right? Also, when dealing with the manager you don't particularly like or enjoy working with, right? But my advice to you would be here, since the number one problem with these answers is that people try to clone someone else's answers and try to make it like it's theirs, because they could not find something that's interesting enough, or because they don't trust themselves using genuine examples in job interviews. In my experience, it's always possible you find these types of stories, and not in every role, interpersonal skills is the core, is subject matter expertise. Like I just said, for developer, it's not the main thing you have interpersonal skills. So you could as well find an example which happened maybe 5 years ago, when you had a slightly uncomfortable conversation with someone, and that's it. But don't put the blame on someone, don't put the blame on your manager in particular, and don't put the blame on your previous employers. Right? This is the types of mistakes that people do. Of course, for manager types of role, executive roles, influencing, interpersonal skills, this is something that's core to the type of role that you're applying for, and therefore the expectations, the bar will be much higher than for a software engineer with these types of questions. Right? Next question. Tell me about the time when you were 75% through project, program, or initiative and had to pivot in order to ensure its successful completion. Okay. Why would someone ask you such a question in a job interview? And you'll notice it's project, program, or initiative. Right? So it goes for a broad range of roles here. Reason for asking you this is your ability to screen on your ability to deliver, right? So it's not always straightforward to deliver to deliver value for the customer, to deliver value for the business, to deliver a project within a given timeline. We all know at some point we have to do some trade-offs. There is some challenge involved with these things, So when you got stuck in a project, could be that maybe you listened to your customer concerns, but you couldn't really understand why the problem was happening and how to fix it. And maybe key there was, you found some data, maybe you called on a friend to help you out, maybe there was a pending update to some software, that was the main issue, was the main challenge in that situation. Or for a software engineer, 75% of a project and you got stuck, maybe you focused too much on an algorithm which wasn't driving the type of results you were looking for, and then you switched that algorithm to something else which diffused the delivery, and eventually it went well, even if slightly over time, right? That's normal, because if you want usually high quality work, in high quality work it's acceptable, you go a little bit over the deadline, but the idea is you use something genuine, right? Real life examples, right? Of course, for PMs it will be straightforward to talk about projects that were challenging, because pretty much any delivering products, especially in a digital context, is always challenging, right? Next one, what's your favorite Apple product? Okay. The main reason why I included this question in the list is because to avoid shooting yourself in the foot with stuff such as iPhone 11. Like I love my iPhone 11. I believe it's a great phone, but they have newer versions as well. So don't shoot yourself in the foot with saying something that's controversial. Maybe say something that it's you would agree with them because you're applying for a job with them as well, right? And finally, tell me about the time when you convinced someone of something. Okay, how do you convince people? Right, so this question is less relevant for software development engineer and more relevant for an executive type of role. Right, convincing someone of something what is key to understand here is you must use your listening skills. If you have great listening skills, you understand what they actually want or what could actually convince them that this would be the right approach to convince them of something. Of course, the more technical the role, the more you're going to be using data to convince someone of something. But even for non-technical roles, you could use as well data. You could maybe do a presentation to make your point. But my point is this makes sense for both customer support, technical roles, executive support roles, but it is expectations vary depending on your subject matter expertise. Right? And last but not least, the time when you learn something new. Right? Very easy question. Now, the challenge is, again, talking about something that relates to your subject matter expertise. When you learn something new for a customer support rep, could be when you learn something new from a customer, right? Or for a PM role, when you learn some new framework, or a developer, could be some new algorithm. Right, but long story short, if you prepare this in advance, then chances are you're going to deliver something that's much more interesting to do a great interview with them, right? So these were my top questions for Apple interviews. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.